Last night I visited an estuary meeting, which, if you haven't heard of Estuary before, it's a really great organization started by a pastor down here in Sacramento by the name of Paul Vanderclay. He noticed that there were all of these non-Christians who were really interested in Jordan Peterson, and they needed somebody to talk to. So he just started doing this Jordan Peterson meetup where people would get together and talk about ideas, and very quickly it went beyond Jordan Peterson to Christians of more existential import, I would say. So eventually he got this idea to create a whole organization that is essentially just all these discussion groups. They're all over the country, called estuaries, and you just get together and you just talk. There's kind of a bidding process for what the group is going to talk about. So everybody goes around and shares an idea they've been thinking about that week, and then you go around again and you have to say, of what I just heard from other people, I think we should talk about this. And as you go around, this consensus kind of forms about what people are finding most interesting, and from there you just jump off and just chat. So I mean, we talked for a good 2 hours. One of the questions that came out of it for me, we ended up talking about the idea of a king and of the stories that we tell ourselves. And I realized that there is this desire for a king, that human beings do have this desire for a king. I know on the right especially, it's been very, very popular to talk about this idea of maybe like an American Caesar or a dictator. There's this desire for a strong figure to come and kind of wipe the slate clean. And so there has been kind of this revival of monarchism, and I think that on the right, Curtis Yarvin is kind of responsible for this idea of the president like a CEO, like a dictator who can come in and just reorganize the entire structure. But I wanted to ask the question of what's going on in this desire that humans have for a king? Because this is an ancient desire. And it's not, I don't think it's just a product of oppression, because people who have not had a king have wanted a king. For instance, the most prominent example that comes to my mind is I think about the Israelites in the Old Testament. When they first came out of Egypt, and then 40 years later, they enter into the Promised Land. For many generations, they never had a king. They had what are called judges. And the judges were these figures who basically God would raise them up when they were needed. Something like a Cincinnatus kind of figure. They were never crowned, and they never successfully passed on this role of judge to their children. It was really just whenever a dispute or a conflict sufficiently intense or difficult arose in the community, this figure would arise who would essentially act as this deciding factor to in one direction or the other, or who would lead the army into battle, and then they would go home. So, but after many generations of this, the people of Israel started to demand a king. They said, we want a king. And of course, Samuel famously says that you're going to regret this, because the king is going to tax you and take your sons and go to war. And of course, that's exactly what happens. That's what kings do. They levy taxes and start wars. But it's interesting that the people felt this desire to have a king. Scripture diagnoses that desire specifically in the Israelite people at the time as a lack of trust in God. One way we could think about that is that the king is a way of saying, what am I trying to say? The desire for the king is this desire for stable leadership rather than somebody to arise at the time when they are needed. It's almost this fear of the emergent properties of communities to be able to push the right person to the surface when the time is needed. And instead, it's a desire to create a long-term, transmissible structure for propagating that authority. I think that's a little bit of that's a little bit of a confused and subtle notion. I should maybe come back to that at some point. But the idea that I'm exploring there of this desire to have a king, I think that it meets a lot of needs. It connects to a lot of desires that we have as human beings. One of them, I think there's a lot of them, and I'll just try to flesh out a few of them. One of them, I think, is the desire for recognition. So we want to be able to be recognized as an other who can participate in a larger project. And we realize that we want that recognition from an entity greater than ourselves. And the king represents the state, represents the community kind of in his body directly. And so the king's recognition of you is a way of you realizing that the community recognizes you. And I think that this connects next to the desire for human beings to surrender. Humans have this desire to surrender themselves to something greater than themselves. And I think that the desire for the king embodies this desire for, I want to be a part of a project that is bigger than myself, that I can give myself to. You know, one of the people last night, he talked about this desire to relieve himself of the burden of his own individuality. And I thought that was a really beautiful way of putting it, because individuality is a burden. And I think that at times we do desire to be able to be relieved of that burden, even if only for a moment. Gadamer talks about the idea of play as a form of knowing. And I think that play is this relieving of the burden of individuality, because it's getting assimilated and lost into the internal flow of an event. You know, you kind of, when you experience play, you lose yourself in it. You kind of leave yourself and then you come back to yourself when it's over, because in an important sense, you were not there. You were a part of what was becoming there. And you were caught up in the internal logics that were negotiating themselves in that event. And that was pleasurable. It was enjoyable. It was, and I think part of why it is because it, one, elevates us to something higher while relieving us of the thing that we feel holds us back, which is our individuality. I also think the desire for the king is this desire for security that I was talking about earlier. There is this desire to be able to look to a singular individual to be cared for, to resolve disputes. The vast bureaucratic machine that we currently have, sort of this headless monster that is constantly just churning in line with policies, protocols, bureaucrats who can just constantly push authority up the chain to who knows where it stops. It's a deeply inhuman experience to be caught up in that machine. I really like David Graeber's collection of essays, Utopia of Rules, where he talks about the inextricable relationship between bureaucracy and violence, because bureaucracy is kind of at its heart. It's stupid. It's the experience of stupidity, kind of a brute force. It doesn't think, it just acts. Almost like a computer. It does exactly what you tell it to, even if that's not the outcome that you wanted. And it just keeps doing it over and over and over again. And there's no one person who's responsible for it. And that experience is deeply dehumanizing, anxiety-inducing. It's absurd. I mean, the literature of Franz Kafka kind of captures this almost mystical experience of absurdity in the face of dumb bureaucracy. So I think that that modern experience of bureaucracy is producing this despair in us, that the solution seems like the craving for a king, the craving for the one who can cut through the clutter and actually begin to get the gears turning again. So there's a lot there. Maybe I'll explore that more in detail to kind of bring things back around. I think that the desire to have a king relates to the desire to be recognized by the community. It relates to the desire for security. And I think that it also relates to, wow, I'm forgetting my second point there in the middle. Well, I'll have to re-listen to this and remember that second point. But hopefully you were listening, and you remember, and I was caught up in the flow. It was the desire for surrender. It was the desire to surrender ourselves to flow, to play, to event, to something greater than ourselves, to be elevated and relieved of our individuality. And the king offers, at least in our minds, none of this is me valorizing kingship or divine right. I think that there's questions there, and I think that there's an extent to which we can never believe those divine right stories again as modern people. But I think that this desire for a king says something about what we are as creatures and the things that we struggle with. Thanks for listening. This is Samsara Audio. Don't forget to subscribe for weekly essays over at Samsara Diagnostics. You can go to samsara.clinic, sign up for free. You'll get an email every Friday morning and sometimes more often. Thanks, and have a great rest of your day.